Welcome to Timbo Talks, a weekly podcast about work and play. This week's episode is a very special episode because I am joined by Oscar Venhuis from Hong Kong. Welcome, Oscar.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me on your talk. Let's call it the show. Although
Yeah,
I'm not sure if people can see us.
Timbo Talks. Well, if the video is great, we can make a decision afterwards whether it will be audio only or we'll reward everyone with our
Visual presence. Well,
visual
yeah,
presence.
yeah. So for those people that cannot see me, I'm actually behind me is a nice ocean of Hong Kong. I'm actually just 20 minutes away from Hong Kong Island. So I'm based in Hong Kong.
And the water looks very calm behind you.
Yeah, which is funny because it's actually really windy.
All right. You have a good audio set up because I can't hear any of the wind. So Oscar, if people Google you, they'll discover you are CEO at EQ Labs. Can you explain to our listeners what EQ Lab is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me think about this. The easiest way to explain it. Well, I'm not going to, of course, explain the role of a CEO, but in a nutshell, what we're trying to achieve with EQ Lab, which does not stand for emotional intelligence, but extended intelligence, is that collectively we are stronger than having a single mind, right? So this is, I would say, the genesis of EQ Lab, where we believe that if we work collaboratively, if we think more collaboratively, not necessarily we agree with each other, but as in a group versus a single individual, we can do a lot more and better and faster. And this is relevant because we live in a time where information comes to us faster than ever. We have more information available to us than more than ever. Um, and it's a world, I'm not sure if it's more complex than, let's say, 100 years ago, because I wasn't living 100 years ago. But I would say that we live in a very complex environment. And in order to find those, let's say, solutions, we do that way better together. So what we are trying to achieve with EQ Lab is basically finding methods and approaches to do this. So you have a lot of theories out there, from design thinking, business design, lean strategies. Well, that's actually a strategy, but let's say there's a lot of theories out there. But what I'm trying to focus on is more the delivery method. And you know this, Tim, so you've joined one of our dialogues. So what I think is, for me, really interesting is we have all those different theories now, of how we are more creative, how we can be more flexible. But I think it's also interesting to, of course, focus on, okay, what is the delivery method? Apart from having a toolbox, how do you actually deliver this? What is the best delivery method for people? Not necessarily what's the best process, but what's the best tool that you can use when you are dealing with people, basically. And that's what we are looking at. So there's a combination of one, hey, we're trying to solve a problem in this case, and what's the best way of solving that problem? And that's basically what we're trying to do with EQ Labs.
Excellent. So creativity is a favorite subject of mine. I mean, the work I do for clients, it's very much about marketing and helping them tell their story. So it's a lot of creative work, distilling ideas into presentable ways to present to the market, writing snappy copy. And last week I recorded a solo podcast where it was a bit provocative. I basically put forward the view that it is really challenging for businesses and organizations to hire creative people today. It's not that creative people aren't out there, it's just that I use the term they were illegible to businesses because businesses are built on processes which are important because they need to consistently deliver value for customers, shareholders, and they need to follow a process. But the people that they want to engage or employ that have new ideas, and innovation requires creative thinking. It's hard for them to get through the recruitment process because creative people have different ways of doing things than perhaps other people in businesses do. Like, you listen to the podcast. Do you object to that, or do you think that's accurate?
I think it's pretty accurate. My approach to it is whether, I mean, I think there's a centuries old dilemma, right, where people don't understand each other, whether it's male, female, different cultures, creative, accountants. So you always have the opposite, the paradox. Um, and I actually was listening to it, so it does strike quite a few things with me in terms of, from a young age, I've kind of given up in trying to explain what I do. Hence the confusion, because of my laziness, maybe, but maybe because I'm just really tired trying to explain what I do. Even including my parents, who actually are very creative, but they still have no clue what I do. To explain to people what creativity is, and not because I don't want to, but I think there is. I have conversations about creativity with certain people, and you see, I know maybe they don't feel that they are creative, but the fact that they're very open to discussing it, I think uh, that's not my alarm to get up, by the way. The fact that people are open to have a dialogue around this, I think, is very encouraging. But I would say by definition that those two groups will never really understand each other. Like, I do not. So my wife is an engineer. She is really the opposite. But and it is not one or the other. I think you can be an engineer and creative. You can be creative and an engineer. So it's not one or the other. And I think the real difficulty is that I think a lot of people believe you're either good in one thing or the other thing, and you can't be good at multiple things. Um, I think what we're trying to, from the last few years, what I've learned from creativity is that, of course, within creativity, you have a lot of different levels, right? So you are very good with words, you're a copywriter. And then you have musicians, you have chefs, you have all kinds of different creative people. I'll give an example of my wife, who's an engineer, but she's creative in terms of cooking. She remembers smells. I don't. I cannot, or flavors. I just don't remember that as much as she does. She is really creative with the memorization of that, but also to come up with creative combinations. So I think, I sent you a link, I think, of Arne Dietrich. He's a professor at the American University in Beirut, and he's done quite a bit of research into creativity. And in fact, we don't know a lot about creativity because it's so complex.
Yes, and you made the observation, which seemed tongue in cheek, but when I thought about it, it made a lot of sense. I was putting forward the position that it was difficult for businesses to hire creative people, but then you came back to me and said it's equally challenging for a creative person to hire someone that they perhaps don't regard as creative, but are still essential to their business. Perhaps it's an accountant or an engineer, or so. There's this divide of understanding which is difficult to cross.
Yeah, so the way I approach this is that I just, instead of trying to come to consensus, right? So I need to convince you that creative is better or worse or whatever that is, or an accountant is better or worse. I just believe that, of course, and this sounds really simple, but I think it's just a mindset difference, is that I don't try to come to consensus, right? I just want to embrace there is diversity. And I think in a lot of discussions, I was raised in Europe, and we love to argue. I mean, it was invented by the Greeks, I think. No, right? The dialogue and argument. And then the whole educational system is designed around this, about, okay, how do you articulate your thoughts into a phrase, or in this case in words or music or whatever that is. And in Asia it's a little bit different, where and I embrace of course that diversity, whereas I'm not saying this is worse, but what I've learned in Asia is that people also embrace diversity, but then paradoxically they also try to achieve consensus, which is really hard, right? So on the one hand you have diversity, on the other hand you want that an agreed roadmap, and I think that there's a bit of a conflict there. You can't have both in terms of, you don't need to have both, I think. Agreement, well, consensus, not agree, not necessarily. So I see consensus similar to agreement, but agreement is not the same as acceptance. So, for example, I'll give you an example like gravity. No, I can disagree with that, but there's a consequence. No, if I jump off a building, I think, well, there's no gravity, boom, and end of me. I just need to accept that. That's just the law, right? Whether I like it or not, that's just the way it is. And also believe that people are different. That's just, I need to accept that. So if I do not accept that people are different, it gets really tough, right? I don't necessarily agree with them, but if I cannot accept that people are different and have different opinions and think different, and the male, female are different, and Australia is different than Britain or wherever the US, I think for myself, I would find it very hard to do anything. And I think that to me is a sort of distinction that I make between, yes, it is for an accountant as hard and vice versa to hire. But I think the difficult part to me is part of everyday life, right? So this is the tension that you try to somehow find a balance, but I don't know if that's the solution, if we ever find that.
Yes, so I made the observation that because creative people were difficult to understand, I likened them to birds, and a bird, it hatches out of the egg, and eventually it leaves the nest, it flies. But because it's a bird, it will eventually fly. Like, the bird doesn't really have to be taught how to fly. It needs to be nourished and supported and fed by its parents up to a certain age, but it will fly. And I made the observation that, like, really creative people, they're bird-like. They know how to be creative, but they actually need an environment that is not an environment that has no tension, but an environment that is open to their creativity. Does that align with your experience?
Yes, of course. The well, again, within creativity are different characters and personalities, right? Or the way people work. So for some people, they work better without rules. And then you have people that if you give them, you just say, okay, do whatever you want, they're not getting anywhere. They're getting completely lost. They almost to the level of depression, because they feel really lost. They need certain guidelines. And there's two extremes in this. And I think you can probably, you can imagine this as well. So I'm the type that's maybe a little bit in the middle, right? So you won't have too many rules, but you need to have some as a starting point. And you don't want to have no rules, because then it's okay, well, I'll just watch TV again and we'll see what happens. And nothing happens, of course. So, of course, this is where the balance is for people, right? So you want an environment that has some kind of structure versus environment that is too restrictive, right? And this can happen very quickly, but it becomes too restrictive. So I agree with your point, yes. And in the metaphor of the bird is quite interesting. Although I would say I like the metaphor because they're two very different entities, right? So human beings and birds. But I don't think they're very equal either, because human beings, we are self-reflective, you know? So our thinking is just way higher than, let's say, a bird, in terms of thinking what is good or doesn't work for us.
Well, one of the blind spots of a creative person, I like to think I'm a creative person, is I tend to pursue analogies or illustrations that seem poetically sound to my ears. But like if we were going to deconstruct it.
Oh, we can if we want to, but no, I think
I
you
mean,
are.
I'm not objecting. I like what you said, but that is a blind spot here for me, obviously.
Well, now I need to. So the one thing that the latest research around creativity, and by no means I'm in academia, right? So the highest level I ever achieved was a master, so that for me was enough. But of course, I'm as intrigued as you in creativity. I was from a really young age. There was nothing else I would consider than being in a creative environment, and maybe that had to do with how I was raised and brought up, but who knows? But I literally from a really young age, I wasn't considering accounting or fireman or or not even pilot, and I just want to become. Well, of course, when you're really young, you have no clue what a job actually means, right? So you start thinking, what do you want to do? And I had a neighbor. I go on a tangent, but come back. I had a neighbor, and I thought he could draw amazing stuff when I was sort of 7, 8 years old, and he could draw those beautiful cars. And I would always ask him to draw a car. And I remember that I think he got a little bit fed up with that. He could not understand why I was so obsessed by him drawing a car. And I really found it really fascinating that people just could take a pen and draw stuff that just was completely made up. And I was really fascinated by that. So I've been always really fascinated about what creativity is. You know, why some people are more creative than the other people. And you know, the professor I mentioned, he researched in terms of, you know, how our brain works. So he's a, let me get the title right, behavioral neuroscientist, I think.
So this is Professor Arne Dietrich that you referenced before, is it?
Yeah. So he looks at the self-consciousness, but he also looks at how creativity works. And basically, his conclusion is that we really don't know anything about creativity apart from a lot of theories out there, either old. So we need to really, if we would understand creativity, then, well, well, not, I simplified, right? So don't rephrase that. His logic is, well, if we would understand creativity after decades of research, we would have been able to replicate this. And he said we still haven't found a technique where we can we can sort of stimulate creativity, but we can't actually scale this. It's really hard. So yeah, he's famous for his what's it called, implicit and explicit thinking. So that we have. So implicit is some things we don't really have to think about, if I get it right. Yeah. So that's two systems. One is, for example, if we like breathe, talk, we don't have to think about that, right? Because it would take way too much time to think about walking. We, in fact, would fall over. And then you have the explicit one, which is like critical thinking. And this is why you're very conscious about thinking itself. And this requires a lot of energy, right? So he came up with this, or he developed this theory of what's called THT, I think, and I don't know actually what it stands for. You can search for a THT theory, but basically this is where he looks into in terms of creativity, or in terms of how we when you relax, so they call the runner's high as well. So when you do something where you kind of drift off a little bit, you suddenly get great ideas. No, that's what people want to sit on the toilet and they have a number two, or they have a shower, or you walk, right? You have your tea in the morning, and then suddenly, boom, you get this idea. And this is also, I think, is called the runner's high. They've tried to replicate this, and they've been unable to do this. Why is it that we think like that? No? How is it that if we are in a more relaxed mode, we sometimes come up with better ideas? In your podcast, you mentioned as well. If you take a step back, you sometimes you switch off for 3 hours, or you go for a walk, you get amazing ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the quality of my ideas when I'm staring at a spreadsheet or a Word document, I know because I observe this. I'm not a bird because I'm self-reflective, but I notice that my ideas are better when, as you say, the runner's high, I'm away from that regular situation and it just comes to me.
Yeah. So the way he explains it, and again, I may misphrase him a little bit, but I try to explain, is that so basically there are 3 levels, right, of thinking. The highest level is self-consciousness. No, whereas animals, we have this lizard brain. It's really instinctive. No, that's the implicit one. So he said, well, what you do when you meditate, he said, is similar to meditation, is that you basically peel off the layers. So the highest, the outer layer is the self-consciousness, right? So we can think of us being in the past while thinking about the future, which is very complex, right? So this is you're very self-conscious about this. When you peel it away, you come to the state of where you don't think about this anymore. You actually disable that function when you kind of in a relaxed mode, or when you meditate, you actually peel away all those layers. Where you sometimes feel you in a flow, where you feel one with your environment. No? And he explains that because all those layers are basically peeled off. So you can't think, you're not self-conscious anymore. So you only think at a very basic level. So his theory is it's actually on a higher level of thinking, but lower level of thinking. Anyway, that's the theory part.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I will actually put a link to that professor in the show notes, Arne Dietrich, because that sounds like very interesting work. So this tension that arises from the fact that creativity is really sort of a mystery. Like, as you say, there's research that points to the state people can be in to get ideas, like the peeling away of the layers. But, peeling away of the layers, it sounds like dissolving boundaries, and business is very much about, we've got a meeting at 10:30, we've got a report to deliver at 2:30, yada, yada, yada. Do you think there's like increased tension between people who, have to keep the business functioning, but also creative people as well? Because, as you say, well, scientifically, the research there, it's still a mystery.
Well, again, with the tension for me, and this is done in advertising a lot, right? They play with this tension, the black and white, the paradox, the underdog, and the great hero, the David and Goliath. So in the creative environment, this tension is for me at least, I can only talk for myself, but with the people I've spoken with, I think it's similar, is that without this tension, things become very boring. Or in fact, yeah, and I think especially for creative people, they really need this tension. It's almost like a dopamine, right? So it's like, if things become very repetitive, if I would always agree with you, you would get really freaking bored of me, right? No, if I always say yes to everything, like, no, you want tea with sugar, yes, 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 yes. You want this, I basically follow you around and would do exactly the same if there's no tension. So I think this tension, especially for creative people, at least for me, is very healthy. I play with this. I enjoy it. But this is where the trick is done, because I enjoy it, but other people don't. Because I still believe that people are being taught not to disagree, and to come to consensus, to find peace. And for me, that these are different. I can find peace, but can still disagree with people, right? And I think this is the beauty of, and well, this is a difficulty talking with people that, like, let's say, are a bit more contrarian, because it's my
Mm.
job. My job is to disagree with people, but otherwise I can't find the solutions, right? Um, so my background is in the creative, in the business design, and by business design you look at different areas. So in order to, you need to be very curious, and that starts with questions. And if you ask a lot of questions, and you may come over as that you are being a threat, or that you actually question the status quo. Um, People don't necessarily like that. And maybe that's one of the reasons why a lot of creative people, I think they're very curious people.
Mm.
They ask a lot of questions. I'm not saying that everyone who is creative is curious, by the way, but
Mm.
the levels of curiosity of that as well.
Remember a few months ago, I was talking to an executive who is very high up in a multinational tech company. And she told me that she actually believes in healthy contention, which isn't consensus. Like contention, as you say, like it's disagreeing, obviously in a respectful way. But it was a surprise for me to hear her say that, because so much of the dialogue around business today is just consensus and agreement.
Yeah, and I think this is really dangerous. In fact, I see this happening around me, where if people, and this is something you need to train yourself as well in how do you have an opposing idea. But sometimes I'm just being difficult, right? Because of course I'm creative, so I'm just being difficult and will ask the difficult question. Or I just like to be the opposite, just to see how people articulate things. Um, but I don't see it as a personal attack if people are against me. What I said, I watch the Fox News, I watch all kinds of different news channels that I probably would completely disagree with. But for me, the danger is that it becomes very polarized in either it's white or black, and there's nothing in between. So now, when I watch Fox News or when I hear Trump, and again, I'm not a Trump supporter or a Fox supporter, but there's certain things that I think, hey, that makes sense. No, that probably is actually in fact true, or yes, that's really entertaining. It's not that everything is bad, right?
Mm.
And I think this is very difficult for. It seems to become more difficult. Where, so I live in China, and there's a lot of shit going on here, as you know, right?
Mm.
But for me to say, hey, everyone in China is just absolutely, whatever, a
Uh-huh.
bad person, would take it to another extreme. And I think people need to be fairly. I think through dialogue, through hearing other people's opinions from a really young age and growing up with that, I think it's very healthy. Um, and it's easy now with, and again, I maybe go off a little bit here, but if you live in an environment and it's also done by social, if only your own opinion is confirmed, right, and emphasized, that, what you read and what you see and what you do around you is just becomes more narrow. You go into a rabbit hole because you only hang out with the same people that agree with you. It's very dangerous.
It
um,
sounds like you actually have a practice that you are disciplined about gathering different points of view. Like you mentioned Fox News, but then other news sources as well. Like that's actually unusual today in 2020 to meet someone. I mean, obviously there are people out there like you, Oscar. I'm talking to you now, but it is unusual to meet people who are open-minded about gathering different points of view. And that could be about any subject, I suppose. But because that doesn't
well,
seem to be the way society and culture is going.
this is really hard for me. The only thing I feel that there is, and erosion of diversity
Mhm.
in terms of how people think, because diversity is just on the planet. We can deny it, but that's completely stupid, right? um, and everyone just thinks different. But if you then flip it, so if you reframe it, it's a beautiful thing, right? This diversity.
Mm.
So, but then if the end goal is consensus, that becomes very difficult, because it's this paradox. On the one hand, you need to embrace this, and on the other hand, some people want to come to consensus, and that's why you see through history the reason why co-creation and new methods and techniques come out, where the old models are designed around consensus. Whether it's a meeting, whether it's a dialogue, whether it's a solution, people try to think about a single solution, or come up with a single solution. Everything is designed around that. But of course, the last few decades we experiment with co-creation. We know that now, with if there's uncertainty, there may be emerging solutions, a multiple solution, and not just one solution, right? And this requires a different way of thinking. But you see that shift. No, I think at least the people I've been talking with, and especially in the creative industry, you see this changing as well, right? And I'm sure you pitch as well. Like, it's really difficult, right, to pitch one single idea that's the best idea.
Yeah, because the best ideas have a habit of like emerging out of a certain set of conditions, and they evolve.
Yeah, exactly. So in the old day, well, in the old day, it still happens. What happens? You go to a client, you have a discussion of an hour or two, and then you leave. You come back 4 weeks later, and then suddenly you should have a solution or your pitch. Right? This is completely absurd, right? After 1-2 hours, you would understand everything what they've been doing for the last 2 decades,
Mm.
and you would solve that for them without just that 2 hour meeting. So yeah, that's, to me, is in some scenarios it may work, but I think creativity works slightly different.
Yeah, so you made the observation that the tension or boundaries, if you like, are really helpful for creative people, because if you can do anything, you can watch Netflix, or you can, there's nothing holding you to account, like no tension, you're probably not going to get good ideas. But if there is a misunderstanding as to how creative people function, whose responsibility is it in an organization to define those parameters, or set the rules of engagement or the tension for creative people? I mean, do you need creative people in those roles as well to manage other creative people?
Yeah, good question. So again, you have different types of people. So I've been in senior positions for quite a few years, and I've tested this, and I've tried to figure out, okay, so I like to work. I'm maybe similar to you. I don't need too many rules. I think I'm grown up enough to have my own schedule. I know my habits. I can break my habits, although that's sometimes harder. But I'm self-aware of my schedule and how I get to a certain outcome. Um, but then I've also noticed that some people don't have this, and they need more structure. No, they need a certain discipline around them to motivate them. Um, and I don't think that's necessarily bad, right? Initially, I mean, I thought, why can't people be so free, right? Why do you need other people to tell you what to do? But some people feel more comfortable with that. So I can't really say if that's good or bad, but you have different people in terms of how they work. Even I think within the creative industry, you have people that work better with certain guidelines, and other people say, "Fuck the guidelines, break them, and we just burn them, and we start from scratch." And these are typically the most creative people as well, but also the hardest people to work with.
Yeah, creative people are often labeled difficult because the way they work, it's hard to replicate, because no two creative people will work the same. And the business might have, a process or a framework to create that tension, but they onboard a new creative who has a lot of experience, but they have like just a completely different way of working. And, you know, providing that person isn't a jerk, they might they might seem kind of difficult to other people in the business because they're coming on board with their own process to, you know, extract that value from their imagination.
Well, and I think adding to that, in terms of the complexity of understanding certain creative people, is that they are so unaware of what that process is. I don't think it's a process. It's certain habits they have, and they're unaware of those habits themselves. So it becomes very chaotic for an outsider, because they do one thing then, and then they do something else, and there doesn't seem to be any process behind it. It confuses people, right?
Yeah.
So I can understand if I'm like, again, so I'll give an example, and I love my wife, by the way. So she's an engineer, right? So it's the complete opposite. So when I cook, I don't really, I read the recipe a little bit, right? And then just go for it. We'll see what happens. And since she's an engineer, she has a different approach to this, right? So she follows the rules, right? And then she tries again, she will make adjustments. And in her way, she does her creativity different. And her, to be honest, her food tastes way better than mine. I mean, I'm just having a go at it without some really thinking about this. So I think subconsciously in the creative environment, I have certain habits that I'm very self-aware of, that I believe, and it's not necessarily a process, because it doesn't always happen in the same way. But there's certain routines and habits that I know I need to do my job. So I see creativity as my job, and that's not a bad thing. But I can't tell a client, say, listen, I just don't feel like it today. No, I'll come back in a few months, right? It's just not going to happen. And I know, on the one hand, and this is also the frustration I think with creative people, that, and I had this discussion, and I like to have one with you as well, is that you're close to an idea, you know, you're close to something, but it just doesn't feel right. And you cannot explain why that is. It just doesn't flow, right? And it's, if someone else, if you show it to someone else, say, oh, this is good. So no, it's not good. It's not good.
Yes, because you know it could be better, because you're feeling intuitively that you've missed something. I know, I'm familiar with that feeling, and it's an ugly feeling.
Yeah, but so how do you? The first question is, how do you know you can do better? So what is it? Because you somehow measure this, you compare it with something, or what is it why you feel you can do it better? And how do you even know when you do it? You also, for me at least, and I think everyone that works in the creative industry or comes to a solution, you if you achieve that level, you if you're, at the end, it's just mind-blowing stuff, right? Like, you feel so happy. It's like this, you go beyond happiness level if it suddenly clicks, think, fuck yeah, this is it, right?
Yes.
It everything falls into place.
I mean, one thing I like to do in that situation is imagine that I'm someone else, that I'm completely removed from this thing. Imagine I've just stumbled across this message or this copy or this offer or whatever it was, and I have no knowledge of it. That's very difficult to do, because you're basically trying to fool yourself. You're pretending to be someone who has no investment in the creative process. But, you know, that's a reasonably reliable acid test. I mean, showing it to someone else, I'm very hesitant about showing it to someone else, because sometimes when you ask opinions, you'll get an opinion, but it may not be the right opinion either.
well, yeah, I was initially like you, right? I don't want to show it to anyone, but now I just show everything to everyone.
Yeah.
Maybe they get bored of that as well. Oscar has not an idea. But I've tried to do the opposite, right? So I always try to, where I think I do one thing, I try to do the opposite thing. And that's one thing that I've actually learned in school, of what I remember at art school, of doing things that you normally wouldn't do. So we did an exercise of, for example, shapes. So the teacher, I don't know if she actually had research behind this, right? But I thought it was really fun exercise. Typically when you doodle, when you make shapes, no, just she asked, okay, I'll give you 1 minute to create shapes on a blank piece of paper. And she asked us to do that 3 times. And what you will notice that you have a specific way of drawing stuff. And you also have a specific way of size and dimensions. It's very subconscious. And basically she asked us, now I want you to do the opposite. No? So if you always draw really small, make it super big. Right? And she had a few of those exercises to really, so instead of, and then putting the shapes that we actually created, she asked us to cut it out in black and on the white piece of paper, and then put them all down. Again, there's patterns in how you put this down. It's not so random as you think. But once you're self-conscious about that, you can make it more random. And then actually also flip it into, okay, well, of course you can keep it upside down, but then also you look at the white space and the black space. So these are all exercises to really force you to continuously think different, and trying to break those habits and patterns that you have. And that's really tough, if I ask someone to do that.
That's excellent. That approach, that sort of exercise, we're talking about shapes, geometry, patterns, that can also help with words. Like, you have a paragraph and just cutting it up and just rearranging all the words, not even with the word processor, just doing it on a table. A lot of it would just be gibberish and nonsensical, but it's a different way of thinking.
Well,
how
yeah,
it all goes together.
Exactly. It's not so much about achieving a great outcome, but it's really more breaking habits. And you may know this game, and I play this in cafes quite a lot, where you start with one sentence on like a little tissue, you fold it, so people, the next person reads the first one, and then you fold it again, right? So you can actually see if you do that back and forth, you get some really interesting stories, right? Because it's really random.
Yes.
And this randomness makes it really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this is also part of creativity, right? Where highly creative people, they can build relationships between stuff that are completely unrelated.
Yes, because like one of the surprises with creativity and what businesses are naturally interested in is coming up with ideas that are original. No one's seen it before.
Yeah, and this is not easy, but so this is, in fact, that's why I call my creativity as a job, because I've been training that for since I left college, I guess. So that's 25 years. And yeah, you need to maintain and train this. And I would say that's one thing I've noticed, where within creativity, of course, you have a lot of different levels of creativity and abstract thinking. But you can do certain things, and this is where, if you are really curious, right? So you love poetry, you like cars, you love to watch Fox News, and you read the Guardian newspaper. And
oh wow, what a weirdo!
But I mean, of course, the bigger you make that database of things, plus then the exercise that you do, then there's a likelihood that you find combinations that other people don't actually see. And if I give you an example, I give you 5 words, right? And I ask you to make something with that. No? And I would ask someone else exactly 5 words to do the same thing. It's very likely or unlikely that you come up with the same thing. But you have exactly the same ingredients. and whether it's words or objects, it's quite interesting that people come up with different outcomes. And that just shows that everyone makes different relations between what they see, hear, and feel.
Yeah, you've really started me thinking a little bit differently with this conversation, Oscar, because it seems that what you're saying, based on your own experience, the world we live in now, there's so many data sources or, vectors of information coming at us all the time. And there is a role for creative people to basically assimilate all this and create something out of it, something relatable to it. Because I would tend to think about, the creative process, getting in the different mindset, doing something differently to crack whatever the creative challenge is that I'm trying to solve. But there's a need for businesses to have creative people to really make sense of the world in a way, because there's just so much information coming into them. Have
Yeah,
I understood that correctly?
yeah. I mean, so and going back to no that thing I mentioned. Okay, why is it that I feel that I can do better? If I self-reflect on that, typically it is that I feel that it doesn't really make sense, right? So the narrative is not it's not 100% right. So there's some little gaps in there where I feel the way I articulate this, either it's visually or through words or music or whatever it is, it doesn't flow, So at that moment, I always feel, okay, I can do better. And when that happens, this is just waterproof, right? This just from all angles, it just works. And that has to do with narrative and trying to understand, at least in my mind, hey, this makes sense. But then, of course, you can hit another wall of that someone else says, well, no, I don't get it. And then you feel, why don't you get this? It makes perfect sense in your head.
Yes. So, I mean, if I was going to be provocative, I like to be provocative just as a mental exercise. If I'm running a business and I need to employ people, like creative people, it would almost be less hassle to have a business where I don't need creative people, because it's difficult to replicate. No two creative people work the same. Just like from a business owner's point of view, it seems like a lot of work to wrangle creative people. I mean, I'm a creative person, so I love creative people, but now I'm putting myself in the mindset of maybe someone who, they may not excel at creativity, but they've got a good head for business or whatever. Like, are creative people just too much work for business?
Are they useless in business, you mean? Yeah, well, on the one hand, yes, maybe they are, depending how you look at this, right? So, of course, some people are just lazy. No, they use the excuse of being creative or sitting in a chair and just and actually do other things. But it depends how you look at this. Ultimately, I think people need to accept that this tension is healthy, right? This diversity. Tension to me is not like a negative um, feeling that I have with other people. But you need to be very confident in that. And this is maybe very scary for a lot of people. I think one thing that I get to hear over and over, and other creative people as well, that they're very, very confident because they're very self-aware. And also the first people to admit that they're either wrong or this is a good insight, and they're very humble at the same time. And I think in order to do that, you kind of need to be very self-reflective. Um, and working with creative people, of course, if you're an accountant and you're not open-minded, or not open-minded in the sense of I'm not trying to understand this other person, but vice versa is the same, right? So a relationship works, you have two people. It's not just only the accountant needs to understand creative people, the creative person also needs to understand the accountant. And it goes both ways, right? So yeah, some companies are better fostering environments where, let's say, those ideas can develop by chance. No, there needs to be some randomness in this. Um, if you over organize it, I think it's not just only for creative people bad, it's just bad for everyone, right? You see that if from a business, if the argument is, hey, let's get rid of the creative people, right? That's basically what, yeah, sort of suggesting, because we actually
They're too
don't
much
understand.
work. Just get rid of them. They're giving me a
Exactly.
headache.
But then if you look at the best performing companies on the planet, they have a whole bunch of creative people. I mean, it's not a group of creative people. The company is creative.
Right.
They embrace this. If you look at the S&P 500, if you look at the listings, all the top 100, or at least the top 100 of companies embrace creativity. You know, if you look at Apple or Google or the big, all the big companies, you know, the big consultancies. So yes, you can cut it out, but you won't get anywhere. At least you will become uncompetitive.
So those big companies you mentioned, the Apples and the Googles, they've embraced the difficulty of creativity. They have that environment. And if other businesses want to be competitive in 2020 and beyond, they really need to embrace a creative environment as well for their top performers. So the work you do with EQ Lab, you mentioned it's not about emotion, it's about extending the intelligence of an organization. So surely extending the intelligence of an organization, there would be a creative component in that, because the value creative people can deliver, that would contribute to the collective intelligence of the organization. Yeah, is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
go on, sorry.
Yeah, no. So yeah, one thing I've noticed myself throughout talking to a lot of people, including yourself, is that ultimately people have their own bias. Right? So I have only one brain. As much as I like to think I can think outside of myself, I don't know. Maybe some people can, but I think it's very difficult for myself, because I'm just stuck with this. Whether people like this or not, I'm stuck with the brain I have and the way I think. Of course, you can develop higher levels of thinking where you try to kind of see different perspectives, and you can do that with a few people, no, friends I have around me. But of course, subconsciously, I pick out my friends, whether I like it or not, because I'm also a lazy bastard in a sense that I don't want to argue after work with people all the time, right? Because it takes energy, you know? And if you want to keep it civil, if you want to really have a constructive argument, although I have dialogues all the time. So going beyond your friendships, no, when you talk about extended intelligence, where you talk about different cultures, where people have completely different environments, I think it's super interesting. We have this all around us. Why not maximize this? Because I think the research, there's research that it just makes perfect sense to have this diversity. Diversity is proven to accelerate ideas, to accelerate solutions. No? It's people that have studied abroad are more open-minded and continue to have a more diverse friendship, are typically more aware of what's going on, right? So for me, it makes perfect sense. Maybe for someone else not, but then again, I'm not trying to make friends with everyone on the planet. But I'm happy to talk to anyone. I've spoken with extreme right, extreme left, people in the middle. I think the worst thing that we can do as human beings is to just shut off and say, hey, this is nonsense. Well, of course, I say it's nonsense, but I'm still really curious why people think like that. Why
Mm.
do people think the complete opposite of me? If it's for me real logic, how is it then the other person should be illogic, right? But they also believe they're logic, so how is that even possible?
Mm. Yeah, so Oscar, what do you think where would be the best place to start for someone in business to begin to create an environment? This is a big question, I know. Begin to create an environment where creativity can start to flow through the organization. You know, obviously embrace the scary part of it, the tension, but what's a what's another area they can look at to start to be
Yeah,
creative friendly?
as a business, right? So I don't really have particular business tips for businesses. The only thing I can say is that I think the first step is that people need to realize this, right? So there needs to be intent. So if there's no intent, then it doesn't matter whether it's creativity or collaboration or anything. There needs to be intent to do this. And typically before you come to this intent that people want to make the step and take it one step further, is just building awareness. So an awareness is about this education of what creativity is. So there's a lot of myths, and maybe fueled by the advertising our own industry about what creativity is, right? So there's this beautiful image of what creative people do. Either we throw paint against the wall, or we work in agencies working our ass off for incredible amounts of money. um, there is this misunderstanding what creativity is. It's this one that's it's if I'm an accountant, it's not something I am, right? Which is nonsense. Because I think ingrained people are creative, but you have different levels. If I taste wine for the very first time, it just tastes absolutely ridiculously shit, right? I don't get it. And as you sort of drink more, you become an alcoholic, but you also appreciate. you, you, no, you start to kind of distinguish the flavors, and then some people go really next level and you have no clue what they're talking about it anymore. But I mean, so the metaphor I'm using here is that creativity is not something that just happens and you can switch it on and off. No? You need to work on this. So if you never been in an environment like your parents or your friends or business environment where people do not promote this, they don't embrace this, then it's really hard, right? And suddenly you are being thrown into a creative environment. It feels very alien and scary. So yes, one part would be like the podcast that you do is part of that education, and engaging people in conversations around creativity. I think every parent would say to their child, if you say, do you want your kid to be not creative? Said, well, I like to be, but everyone likes to be creative. I've never heard anyone say, I don't want to be creative.
Mm.
I think so. People do understand what creativity is, but then as you get older, that's because of so many rules that we have is taking away. We become less and less. We train ourselves and we allow ourselves and all other people to be less and less creative.
Yeah, I liked your example of wine. So what I'm hearing is people in hiring positions need to develop their creative taste buds and not be so fearful about being inebriated through exposure to creative
And wine
people.
is actually a very good accelerator for that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that is
And
interesting.
and and beer helps as well as an
Yes.
accelerator. And again, there's research out there that with a small amount, right, of
Yes.
accelerator,
I,
it helps.
I have experienced that myself. If I have a difficult piece of copy to write and I just get the first bit of a buzz from a glass of champagne, more often than not, it comes. But as you say, you keep doing it, then it drops off. But there's that window, that narrow window. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and of course, this is about being self-conscious. Okay, how much can you drink and cannot drink, versus other things that you do, right? So what helps and what doesn't help, and that's different for everyone. How they come up with new ideas. For me, it's mostly okay. How do I, in the environment, like in business design, when I get a project, you work with very opposing elements in business, if it's about business design. So it's all about business strategy, so it's all about making money, or adding value there. You talk about, of course, design itself, of how do you design an organization, and then there's elements of technology in there as well, and multiple. So you have this massive puzzle of all those different things. So there's a real challenge to somehow make that cohesive. No?
So a well-designed organization, which, that's a whole other subject for a podcast, but obviously we need well-designed organizations for them to function properly and to have the right people being able to share and distribute their value throughout the organization and to the organization's customers. So I imagine that's something you deal with as well, designing organizations.
Yeah, I've been doing that for quite a long time. So from corporate to startup, of course, I run my own business now, but including, now I know that this is your favorite thing, hiring. I've looked at how people are being hired.
Oh, right.
So I so I also looked at how can I redesign this process, because it's a massive pain point.
Yes, it
That
is.
and it hasn't really changed.
Mm. So you're talking to me from Hong Kong with the lovely harbour in the background. I'm talking to you from Sydney, Australia. Oscar, do you think there are certain regions on the globe that are more amenable or are more open to some of these ideas we're talking about, like bringing creative people on board? Like, is the Asia Pacific region more open to having creative people delivering innovation than other regions of the world? That's a big question, I know.
Yeah, that's a big question, and of course, it's a very it's hard to give one single answer. So what I can say in terms of my personal experience is that I believe that everyone on the planet, when they're younger, right, before they go into an educational system, is creative. But there are environments on the planet, and I would say that Asia is probably part of that. Certainly, certain places in Asia, where yes, there is it's so structured, and the whole the process is to kind of not break down, actually to introduce more and more limitations, to the extent that there's no room for creativity left. So those environments definitely exist, and I would say that exist everywhere. If you look at education as a whole, no? If you look at universities, if you look at primary schools, and that's basically transcended, that's transferred to businesses. No? It's all this one process. I mean, in Hong Kong, you basically, as soon as you are born, there's this process going to university and getting the best job. It's like this roadmap that parents have. I'm not sure of how healthy that is for creativity, but I also believe that within all those, let's say, restrictions that I work in, I think I'm still relatively creative. Um, but maybe because I was already older, so I was self-aware of this, right? So if I would guess that certain environments are less um, conducive for um, for chance, no, for doing things just by pure luck. Well, not luck, but where you create an environment where you don't do anything because there is an objective to achieve anything, right? You just do it because you like it, and this is maybe one of the reasons why I always say to people that when you have a creative mind, you're never bored, right? You just do stuff. And a lot of people ask me, Oscar, you work on so many projects, but why do you even do it? Because it's not going to make money. But that's not really the purpose why I do those things. You know, for me, it's about exploration. Okay, I've got this one life, let's say, and I've got limited time. What can I do to make maximum impact? You know, that's the way I think. So there is sort of end goal to it, but sometimes I don't know how I get there. So I do all those different experiments. Some for fun, some may turn out not so fun, and other experiments may just lead to something, like the podcast that you do today, right? Did you start this to make money?
No,
Was that clear?
I tell you exactly why I started it. The best part of my day job is talking to interesting people. It's not the only thing I do, but this is the self-reflection piece. When I look at what I enjoy, what keeps on coming up is I love talking to people, particularly interesting people like yourself. Oh, how can I scale talking to interesting people? Maybe I'll start a podcast. That's exactly where it came from.
Yeah, it's a good exercise, right? You learn a lot from it. So I have a webcast as well, and yeah, and I've noticed the different people. So some people, they just want to look better. They improve how they look online. The conversation doesn't really evolve. And then you have podcasts like yourself, where you really, the great thing about the world that we live in is that we have those people with some crazy ideas and beliefs. It's just insane, right? How certain people start believing certain things, and they may say exactly the same thing of me. Um, and that's also actually one of the reasons why I interview other people, because for me they're very normal people. But if they tell the story, it's actually really not that normal for a lot of people. So for me, it's okay, what is normal, what's not normal, and that's, yeah, I agree with you in terms of dialogue. Um, we live, to me, we live in an amazing world where we can do this.
Well, Oscar of EQ Lab, I thank you for extending my intelligence.
What else can I say?
Oscar, you do a lot of different things, but if people want to find out more about you, where's the best place to go?
Google. Just type it. If you can type my name correctly, there's not that many people with my last name, I think. I have actually no clue. Maybe you can do that yourself right now,
Okay.
what comes up. But I think if you do either EQ Lab or you say Oscar Venhuis, Venhuis, you'll get this. I'll be first one on the page. Um, and there's all kinds of stuff that you probably find.
Excellent. Thank you for your time, Oscar. I've really enjoyed this conversation. If you want to hear more Timbo Talk episodes, you can find me on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. And you can also find me on Twitter as Timbo Horan, Timbohoran. Oscar, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim, for inviting me.